We're on page 51.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone, we are starting with on the origins and methodology of the Boston Busing Desegregation Project, our 1,000-word transcription of a conversation with Donna Bivens at the height of the COVID lockdown.
Right. So just start. You're gonna tell me when to stop. What do I do? How much
Go
do
ahead
I read?
and just read until you want to pass. Read a couple of paragraphs and then pass, and somebody else will take it.
Okay. All right. After 20 years as co-director of the Women's Theological Center, I was asked to work on the Union of Minority Neighborhoods project, which was to look at busing and desegregation in Boston. The way UMN got into that was through the criminal records reform work they were doing, and a lot of stories started coming out about people's trauma around segregation. There's this link. The incarceration rate started going up in the 1970s in Boston, which was the same time as the desegregation crisis. So after Corey reform, the UMN started organizing around school issues. The Boston Busing / Desegregation Project story collection started with the film Can We Talk? In the film were people we met through organizing in either the courts or the schools. I continue to think that we made a good decision to start with the people we knew because they had a view of this that most people did not see. And in many ways, what they saw and where they stood in the system tells you a lot about where we are today. We used the film to go around and ask people, is it important to visit this history? And if so, why? Even before the film, we started asking people that, and they would say, yes, it's important to visit the history, but not as a history lesson. Do it to see what it means for today. We were clear that we needed to really look at this history that was living. We used the film to talk to people in a lot of Boston suburbs and to get a sense of how this history is alive. We looked to see what the recurring themes were. It taught me a lot about where we are right now. The stories were amazing. After that, we produced a report, Unfinished Business, 7 questions, 7 lessons. And that we took those stories and looked at patterns. I try not to bring my lens of systemic racism so directly. I really try to listen to the people and not impose something on them. I was constantly trying to see what was happening systemically, looking for similarities, differences, and exchanges, ways of looking at how information is shared. If you're dealing with a system, you can't really change the system. You can influence it, but you can't really change it because it's active. That's how I think about white supremacy. You go back and forth to move it.
Awesome. Let's thank you so much, Latoya. Would someone else like to read?
That sentence wasn't finished, actually. It goes to the next page.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I was trying to catch up. Nia, why
I'll
don't you
finish the next sentence and unless somebody else ready to jump in.
Okay,
say something different. You want me to finish this? I can finish. It says to say something different, to try to influence it, but it is there and it hasn't been destroyed. It continues to mutate. It continues to change and move. What were the questions that were coming up then are still relevant now? That's how the report was organized. People would ask questions like, why don't people just get over it? That became one of the questions, and it brought up an exchange between who gets to get over it, or question, whose city is it? Whom does the city belong to? This issue has been going on since the beginning of the city. Talking to some people in South Boston, they're been pretty much taken over, but it wasn't by Black people or people of color. It was class. It has been gentrified. In the report, we started out with the question, whose story is it? But as we started using the questions, we refined it to whose story counts. Another question was Boston's desegregation crisis about racism, or was it about classism? because there was a Black story, there was a white story, there was also a Latinx story, and an Asian story. And it was much more complicated when you got into some of that. It was much more nuanced story. It was a much more nuanced story about what happened. You had to you had cross-racial conflict, racism, and they were all intersecting. Another question was, what is excellence? Excellence wasn't just about the school. It was also about who gets to decide what excellence is, who gets to decide what's important in terms of education and those issues. 53, often people, sorry, 54, we're on page 54. Often people, oh, go ahead.
Thank you, Kay Anthony. It changed my own understanding and clarified it a lot too. How racism is so central and keeps people in this country from seeing so many things. It makes people sort of stupid. Racism is real. I was born in the South and raised in the Midwest, and Boston is the first place I lived where I was called the N-word by people driving down the street. My sister and I were walking and had a bottle thrown at us. It was all over the city. It was strange because Boston has this reputation with a lot of people, but not with Black people, for being a very liberal city. That whole myth was being punctured in the late 1970s because the response to desegregation was so violent. I see the way that people don't even want to talk about it. I think I'm more perplexed now than I was back then about how it plays out, especially within the education system. Racism is so foundational to understanding so many things in this country. And you have this whole white supremacist fear-based energy building. There's a lot more enlightenment on one hand, and a lot more pushback and even violence on the other hand. Often, people my age or older who got into desegregation or who brought about desegregation have their own view of racism and could see patterns, and that was really important. People who've grown up in this era, younger people we talked to, were upset that they didn't know this history and were piecing it together with their experience. If you're older and have gone through all this, you see patterns. But if you're growing up in this time, you see that it's not back then and things have changed a lot. Sometimes the intergenerational struggle I see, especially among Black people, is holding both of those. Pass.
Go ahead. Yes, there are repeating patterns, and this time is totally different from that time. What you are centering in your life is very different. How can you have that conversation in a way that is respectful of both? We have a very complex situation right now. You have to understand the whole thing. You need the diversity and difference to figure out where you are together. Where do we stand? What do we see based on where we stand? I feel that society with this virus is so exposed. It's just as much about the problems with the society. In a lot of ways, we're going to have some hard lessons. Instead of learning something, we seem to be going in a total opposite direction. The opposite of love is self-centeredness.
That's it. That's the end of the chapter.
Yep.
That's it. Mic drop. Thank you. Nia, do you think we should pause and invite people to reflect on their thoughts, ask Donna any questions? We actually have Donna here with us in the room. I'm curious, because that was so long ago now, what Donna thinks hearing these words read back to her. So Nia, do you think we should pause, or should we jump right into your chapter and then come back around to both of them?
Sure, let's pause. It seems appropriate to pause.
Okay. Donna, how do you feel? How do you feel hearing that now?
I like hearing it because, you know, after I did it, I got sick during COVID, not from COVID, but I couldn't really re-engage with it. And I was thinking, oh, this doesn't make any sense. But then now it makes sense. And I think I still agree with myself, which is, you know, sometimes you don't even agree with yourself anymore. So it's funny to see that. And I think with the I was seeing at the beginning of the pandemic how it was going to change things. I feel even clearer how much everything that we're talking about has just been, I don't know, just it just exploded since the pandemic. So I just really feel like I'm in a place of trying to figure out where we are, and really grateful for this conversation, because having read some of the other things, I just think there are a lot of lessons in here to move from.
Thank you, Donna. Does anyone have any thoughts, any questions before we move into reading Nia's chapter? I'm really excited that these two were paired together to start. Donna starts us off with what the ground looked like here. Oh, you know what? You know who I want to hear from?
Wait,
Louise Baxter.
wait, Tomashi.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Yeah, I'll say it. I got that thing when she said, talking about people say, why don't they just get over it? Because I hear a lot of that they just get over it, that some people just want to think of the blacks. Like I hear that a lot in South Boston sometimes, that they don't, and it kind of gets me. Trump has brought this stuff out more before, and I think there was some classism in it too. It makes it, because I feel like I worked at the high school, I suffered it, but I did believe in we should be integrated. But what got me is that the people in the suburbs were telling us, and we were the bad guys, and they weren't looking in their own backyard, and that got me. That is the class thing. Like they're always pushing the stuff onto the working class. Because when I worked at the high school, I came from the country, and the other stuff, I didn't like it when they talked about rednecks and everything. I mean, I was for integrating the schools, but you didn't like condemning them, because like I came from the country, and I thought, but then when it came busing, I just got out of college, I graduated, I was on the civil service list, I worked for the nurses, and they said, well, this is my backyard, I can take a stand. And I kind of feel that actually I did get some harassment from the Ku Klux Klan and stuff like that, and some harassment, but actually I moved up in the community. I got like working with kids or something, like, well, I got job interviews. They called me for job interviews. They didn't before. So sometimes by taking a stand that you did it, because it was, but I feel like it's still, they're looking down at the wrong people. They're getting them to blame the blacks and not the ones above.
But that's
I don't
interesting.
feel.
Thank
That's what
you.
you're saying. Oh, sorry.
Hold on a second, Anthony, because we have a hand up and we also have a question in the chat. Thank you so much for that reflection, Louise. Lady, hold on one sec. We have Luna in the chat with a question. What was it like having those cross-cultural conversations on advocacy with Latinx people in particular? And this sounds like a question for Donna.
Yeah, it's a long story. I mean, there are just there were just so many stories that came up during that time, and there's one woman who was very involved, Carmen Pola, who really helped us to tease out the history in Latinx community. But it's very complex, because it brings up stuff about, as you get further down the road with the deseg, you also get into issues of bilingual education. You get into the race issues within Latinx community. It's very it's a long story. It's a long story. Cardina's here too, and Cardina worked on the project. I wonder, she might have something to say about that.
Thank you, Donna, for your response. I appreciate it.
Before we move on to Lady Cardina, how do you feel about that? You want to jump in with any reflections on that question from Luna? Cardina? Hey.
Hi. I do want to comment, but I'm not going to comment now. I was in the middle of trying to write something in response to Tracy's talking about the struggle of sharing stories across generations. I think it's not just across generations, also across class lines, which aren't necessarily individual. A friend of mine was talking to me today about education in the city of Worcester and the difference in educational expectations and what's happening there related to the CRT and the book banning and the rest of it, and the way in which the public educational system is going along with a lot of the stuff compared to what she said in Boston. And she was just talking about, because she's lived both in Boston and Worcester. And so for me, that was something that's also, the struggle was a lot about not just race, but about class. So that's one comment I want to make, in response to Tracy's comment.
Thank you, Cardina. And then I want to thank Nia and Sierra for helping me. While I'm screen sharing, I can't really see the chat so easily, but I do see the hand. We're going to use the hand raise function. Use the hand raise function or the chat to communicate. Lady's hand is up, and then I feel like Nancy's hand is eking up. And then we should read because we actually, I'm sorry.
Just real quick, Canthony had a response. So I put in the chat, next up lady, then Canthony, then Nancy, and then I guess we can read. So I'll put the order in.
Awesome, fantastic. Thank you, Nia.
Just jump in. Okay, I'll just jump in. So I moved here from New Jersey.
Hold on 1 second. That's the order looks like lady.
Then Canthony, and then Nancy.
And Nancy.
Well, just real quick, okay, so I remember what we were saying and what we were fighting in the 60s. And so across generations and within generations, there's really the barrier to sometimes to communicate. But I just want to say that it's not just class. So I mean, sometimes people conflate class with racism. And I just see that as not being a real narrative, because like you could be Derek Bell, tenured professor at Harvard Law School. You're on some road in the South, or it doesn't have to be the South, it could be right here in Boston. And some police officer could, Fruitvale Station you right then and there.
Thanks, lady. Next is Anthony.
Real quick, because everybody knows I'm long-winded. Very quick. There's an interesting thing about, I have to find this quote about every history has a history, and how history, people have particularly interest in erasure of histories and certain types of narratives that then certain threads pop up in the contemporary moment that have a longer episode. That history is this continuous thing. Like people think history starts and stops and certain aspects end, but no, they continue in a different way. Are they more? But the relationship, and I think Nia has some research on this, where she talked about redlining the relationship to race. So this relationship to class, about like where people can live or where they can have home ownership and how that impacts the education system. It's all of this complicated ecosystem that works in this type of way of keeping certain people oppressed, keeping certain people in certain neighborhoods, keeping certain people educated in a certain type of way.
Thank you so much, Anthony. And thank you for helping to make this publication a reality. I also want to add really quickly that this is a very special, this new edition, the second edition is very special because it's Boston Ujima Project's first publication, first hard copy publication. I'm not sure if anything like this has even ever happened at Radcliffe before, but those of you who get the new book will have an edition that has the Boston Ujima Project Ashe Ashe Cultural Assembly Grant now in the table of contents and very proudly on the spine. I love it. And on the back. Nancy.
Okay, I'm originally from New Jersey, and I grew up in the 50s and spent the 60s in New York very racially segregated in that time. I moved to Boston in 78, and I love this from the drawing that Boston, I thought, was going to be a very liberal city, a myth. I found out it was a myth. When I moved here in 78, I was like, oh. And the changes I've seen is just like unbelievable. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
Thanks, Nancy. And then we'll go to Tracy and then Nia, and then we have to start reading Nia's chapter because we only have 30 more minutes.
Okay, really quick. I really would like for us to maybe, as a person that is from the South, grew up in the South, sometimes I think racism gets regionalized as a Southern poor white affliction or a Southern poor white Midwestern affliction rather than a systemic issue that is endemic across the world and particularly in the United States. And so I really want us to kind of break away from making the distinctions of in the South and in the North, because for me, when I think about the busing and desegregation in Boston, my first image or the image that comes to me is a very violent image of what happened in right outside of Boston's City Hall with and I don't remember the gentleman's name, but there was like a flag and yes, Ted Landsmark. And so that particular image is and I might have said the name incorrectly, but that particular image is it's a very violent and very disturbing image, but it did not happen in the South. It happened right here in Boston. And I think we need to kind of center ourselves and stop thinking that, oh, I didn't think that Boston would be so racist. Well, we're in the bedrock of like where colonization was born and imperialism is born. And so for us to pretend like this doesn't happen here is to really kind of gaslight ourselves. And I hate to use like maybe very strong terms, but I think we gotta maybe refocus that narrative, and then I'll pass it over to Nia.
Thank you, Tracy. I just wanted to just point out a couple of the non-textual elements here, and I appreciate you, Nancy, going to the drawing. What I found myself looking at were the photos on page 54 and 55. So the photo on page 54, the caption underneath says members of the Boston University Mental Health Center consultation and education program. And this is from the Ruth Batson papers. And then the photo on page 55 is Polly Murray standing on a rock cliff in Central Park. So I just wanted to point these out and throw a question to Tomashi maybe, or other members of the research team, just about these photos and why they were selected for Donna's excerpt.
Awesome. I'd like to kick that to Kayla.
Am I responding to the chat too, or just?
Nope, just Nia's last question about how we chose these images. What
Okay.
their significance is.
Okay, just making sure, because there was like a little bit blurb in the chat. But I'll answer this in two parts. So we all kind of divided ourselves among different archives, both on Harvard's campus, but also in Boston proper, so Boston Public Library, and really just like combing through images, not refining our keywords too much, because it's a conversation we had about archives that was really important when it came to looking for images that would either serve Tomashi in her actual artistic practice or serve the publication, is that narratives are often omitted by just poor cataloging and cataloging that doesn't account for nuances of Black experience. And it's an issue that I'm pretty sure King Anthony runs into, and that I definitely run into a lot when I'm doing research projects, is that you believe that there are not certain images of a particular issue or social construct, but it's that they've been categorized in a way that they're almost kept away from you. And so we had to spend time actually physically in the archives, pulling different boxes. And I think we particularly came, I don't want to say obsessed, but quite fascinated with Ruth Batson, and also just kind of falling in love with the images and the people that we got to know through that archival process. And it definitely opened up things for me and transformed my own dissertation project too. And so it became a conversation with sort of the remnants and the pieces that people left behind, but it also led us to ask different questions and to kind of reconsider who it was that we needed to talk to. And even just like the importance of a project like this. And then again, the second part of that is how that archival practice had to change once everything shut down. And so we had to start thinking different. Like we only had what we had scanned and requested. Very few things are digitized. It's often even harder to find digitized images that are vernacular or everyday images that we were really looking for being digitized, because that's not considered important history. And our whole entire story was buried in the everyday. Something as basic and mundane as education is going to be documented differently and has to be attended to differently in the archive. But it was really hard to get those images post everything shutting down. So it was really a way for us to commune with the past and get to know these people, not just as history, but get to know their stories and give them the space that they deserved, not only in the publication, but it'll definitely live on through people that get this publication and, you know, are sparked by something. And then, I don't know if you wanted to address, there's a few comments that happened before I spoke.
We're going to come back to those comments after we read the next chapter. This is just so great. Thank you so much, Kayla. And I can also add that the Harvard Radcliffe Institute houses the only library devoted to the history of women anywhere. And so the Schlesinger Library on the history of women in America is the holder of Pauli Murray's papers, a portion of her papers, photos that she bequeathed to them well before she passed away. And they are also holders of Ruth Batson's papers. Both of these people we find to be undersung, very important heroes, people who know them, know of the mark that they made on education advocacy, consider them to be the spines of Brown as legislative policy that it became, and a part of the spine of education advocacy in Boston.